A freezing night, a single act of kindness, and the deafening roar of 100 choppers shaking the asphalt, when a shivering teenager handed over his only winter jacket to a stranded Hell's Angel. He thought he'd made a quiet sacrifice. He had no idea he'd just summoned an army. The wind howling through the Cascade Mountains that November sounded less like moving air, and more like a wounded animal tearing through the pines. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the temperature had plummeted to a brutal 14 degrees. Inside Cooper's Gas and Grub, a dilapidated service station sitting entirely alone on a desolate stretch of Highway 26, 17-year-old Toby Harrison was desperately trying to stay awake. Toby wasn't supposed to be working the graveyard shift. He was a high school junior, carrying a solid B average despite operating on a permanent deficit of sleep. But his mother, a waitress at a diner 3 towns over, had recently had her hours cut, and the stack of red-stamped past-due bills on their kitchen table was growing into a small mountain. Toby had begged his manager, a gruff old man named Arthur Pendleton, for the extra hours. Arthur had agreed, leaving Toby alone to manage the pumps, the stale coffee, and the terrifying isolation of the mountain pass in the dead of winter. To combat the biting drafts that slipped through the cracks in the gas station's cheap windows, Toby was wearing his most prized possession, a heavy, fleece-lined, insulated Carhartt jacket. It was practically brand new, a dark, rugged canvas armor that he had saved up for over 3 months. It wasn't just a jacket, it was his survival gear. Toby didn't own a car. Every night at 2 a.m., when his shift ended, he had to walk 2 miles down a pitch-black, unlit dirt road to get back to his family's small, drafty trailer. Without that jacket, the walk was not just miserable, it was actively dangerous. Outside, the first violent flurries of a forecasted blizzard began to slam against the glass. The radio crackled with static, the local DJ warning everyone to stay off the roads. The ice was thickening, turning the asphalt into a black mirror. Then, through the howling wind, Toby heard a sound that made his stomach drop. It was the distinct, heavy, rhythmic sputter of a V-twin motorcycle engine. But it sounded sick. It was coughing, backfiring, and struggling against the gale. Toby wiped a circle of condensation off the glass and peered out into the dark. Beneath the flickering, yellow halo of the single working streetlight in the parking lot, a massive Harley-Davidson lurched to a halt. The engine gave one final, violent shudder and died completely. The rider sat frozen for a moment. Then, with movements that seemed stiff and agonizing, he swung a heavy, leather-clad leg over the seat and kicked the stand down. As the figure walked toward the glowing neon open sign of the convenience store, Toby's pulse quickened. The man was a giant, standing easily 6'4", broad-shouldered and heavy-set. But it wasn't his size that made Toby swallow hard. It was what he was wearing. Over a thin flannel shirt, the man wore a heavy leather vest. Even through the falling snow, Toby could clearly see the patches. The top rocker arched over a grinning skull with wings, the infamous Death Head logo. The bottom rocker proudly declared his territory. It was the full, unmistakable colors of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. In this part of the Pacific Northwest, the Hells Angels were legends, spoken about in hushed tones. They were a fiercely guarded brotherhood, known for their strict codes, their intimidating presence, and their absolute intolerance for disrespect. Seeing one alone, stranded in a blizzard, was like finding a wounded apex predator in your living room. The bells on the door jingled violently as the biker shoved his way inside. A blast of sub-zero air followed him, scattering a stack of lottery tickets off the counter. Toby immediately noticed two things. First, the man was older, likely in his late 50s, with a thick, greying beard that was currently caked in solid ice. Second, and more alarming, the man was shivering violently. His lips were a terrifying shade of pale blue, and his skin had the waxy, bloodless look of severe hypothermia. Don't tell me you're closed, kid." The biker rasped. His voice was deep and gravelly, but it trembled so badly he could barely form the words. No, sir," Toby stammered, his grip tightening on the mop handle. "Open till 2. The biker nodded slowly, staggering toward the back of the store where a small, ancient space heater sat glowing orange on the floor. He practically collapsed onto a milk crate beside it, holding his massive, bare, tattooed hands toward the weak heat. His leather vest offered zero protection against the biting cold, and his thin flannel was soaked through with melted snow. "Bike gave out," the man muttered, almost to himself. "Alternator, I think. Lost the headlight 2 miles back. Rode blind until the engine seized." Toby stood frozen behind the register. He had been told by other clerks to never engage with the motorcycle clubs that occasionally passed through during the summer, to just ring them up, keep his head down, and let them leave. But this wasn't a pack of loud, imposing riders. This was one man who looked like he was freezing to death. "I have fresh coffee," Toby offered, his voice cracking slightly. "It's on the house." The biker looked up, his ice-crusted eyebrows raising slightly. Yeah, that'd be good." Toby grabbed a large styrofoam cup and filled it to the brim with the steaming, black sludge that had been sitting on the burner for the last 2 hours. He walked around the counter, keeping a respectful distance, and handed it to the massive man. The biker reached for it, but his hands were shaking so uncontrollably that he nearly dropped the cup. Dark coffee sloshed over the rim, burning Toby's knuckles, but he held steady, helping guide the cup to the man's hands until he had a firm grip. "Thanks, kid," the biker grunted, taking a long, scalding sip without even wincing. "Name's Jim. They call me Big Jim Larson." "Toby," the teen replied, taking a step back. "Well, Toby, you picked a hell of a night to work the register," Jim said, offering a weak, shivering smile. The warmth of the coffee seemed to bring a tiny bit of color back to his face, but the violent shaking didn't stop. Hypothermia had already set in deep into his core. Do you need me to call someone? Mr. Larson?" Toby asked. "A tow truck, the police." Jim's eyes snapped up, flashing with a sudden, sharp intensity. "No cops. I don't need no blue lights out here, and a tow truck ain't gonna do me any good right now." He set the coffee down on the floor, rubbing his hands together. "I ain't out here for a joyride. Kid, my chapter brother, my best friend, Thomas, he's up at St. Jude's Medical Center in Portland. They called me an hour ago, said he's not making it through the night. I gotta be there." Toby felt a pang of empathy. He remembered the night his own father had passed away in a sterile hospital room, and the desperate, suffocating panic of trying to get there in time to say goodbye. "Portland is 40 miles from here," Toby said softly. "The roads are icing over. Even if your bike was running, you'd never make it in this storm. Not dressed like that." Jim let out a frustrated, rattling cough. "I'll hitchhike. I'll walk if I have to. I ain't letting him die alone." The biker tried to stand up, his massive frame towering over Toby, but his legs immediately buckled. He fell back onto the milk crate, his breathing shallow. He was losing the battle against the cold, and the drop in his core temperature was making him uncoordinated and weak. Toby looked out the window. The snow was falling thicker now, a blinding white sheet obscuring the highway. Nobody was driving in this. Hitchhiking was a death sentence. Toby remembered that old man Henderson, a local freight hauler, was parked around the back of the station, sleeping in his cab before making a late-night run toward Portland. Henderson was a gruff guy, but he owed Toby a few favors for covering up the times he'd left the diesel pumps a mess. "Wait here," Toby said, turning toward the back door. He dashed out into the freezing wind, sprinting around the side of the building to the massive 18-wheeler idling in the dark. He pounded on the heavy metal door until a very grumpy Henderson rolled down the window. After 5 minutes of frantic explaining, pleading, and calling in every favor he had, Toby convinced the trucker. Henderson was heading right past St. Jude's anyway. He agreed to take the biker, but he warned Toby, "I'm leaving in exactly 3 minutes. Kid, if your biker friend ain't in the cab by then, I'm rolling without him." Toby sprinted back inside, practically sliding across the linoleum floor. "Jim, I got you a ride. A trucker out back is heading straight to Portland. He can drop you 2 blocks from the hospital." Relief washed over the giant biker's face. He forced himself to stand, grabbing the counter for support. "Kid, I owe you. You have no idea." But as Jim stood up and the door to the station blew open, letting in a horrifying blast of sub-zero wind, Toby realized a fatal flaw in the plan. The truck's heater had been broken for weeks. Henderson drove in a heavy parka. Jim, shivering violently in his wet flannel and leather vest, wouldn't survive the 40-mile, slow-moving drive in a freezing truck cab. Jim felt the wind and stopped in his tracks, his teeth chattering so loudly it echoed in the quiet store. He looked down at his own trembling hands, realizing the grim reality of his situation. He was too cold. He wasn't going to make it. Toby looked at the clock. It was 12:30 a.m. He looked at Jim, who was staring out the door with a look of desperate, quiet defeat. Then, Toby looked down at his heavy, fleece-lined Carhartt jacket. He thought about the 2-mile walk home in the dark. He thought about the biting wind, the ice, and his mother's frantic worrying. He thought about how long it had taken him to save the money for it. 3 minutes, Henderson had said, before his brain could talk him out of it. Toby unzipped his jacket. He slid it off his shoulders, the sudden absence of its warmth sending an immediate, shocking chill down his spine. He held it out toward the towering Hell's Angel. "Take it," Toby said, his voice steady despite the sudden cold. Jim Larson stared at the thick canvas jacket, then looked down at the skinny teenager standing before him in nothing but a faded, thin cotton flannel shirt. The biker's eyes widened in disbelief. "Kid, are you out of your mind?" Jim rasped, stepping back. "You work in a freezer. I saw you looking at that clock. You got to walk home, don't you?" "I'll run," Toby lied smoothly. "It'll keep me warm. You need it more. The truck doesn't have a heater. If you don't take this, you're not going to make it to your brother." Jim hesitated. In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, nobody gave you something for nothing. Trust was earned in blood and miles, not handed over a linoleum counter by a kid making minimum wage. But as he looked into Toby's eyes, he saw no angle, no calculation, just a kid trying to help a man in pain. A loud, piercing blast from an air horn shattered the silence outside. Henderson was warning them. Time was up. Jim reached out with a trembling hand and took the jacket. The thick canvas looked almost comical in his massive grip, but as he slid his arms into the fleece-lined sleeves and pulled it tight over his leather cut, a low groan of absolute relief escaped his lips. The heavy insulation immediately trapped his remaining body heat. "Toby," Jim said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the tremor for just a second. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy silver Zippo lighter, tossing it onto the counter. "I don't forget. And the angels don't forget." Before Toby could respond, the giant man turned and pushed his way out into the blizzard, jogging toward the idling semi-truck. Toby watched through the frosted glass as the passenger door swung open. Jim climbed inside, and the massive rig roared to life, disappearing into the blinding white snow. Toby was completely alone again. He walked over to the counter, picked up the heavy Zippo lighter, and slid it into his pocket. It was freezing cold against his leg. The next hour and a half moved at an agonizing crawl, every time the wind hit the windows. Toby shivered. When 2 a.m. finally arrived, he locked the front door, shut off the neon sign, and turned off the lights. He stood by the back door for a long time, staring out into the pitch-black night. The snow had stopped, but the temperature had plummeted even further. It was 10 degrees. Taking a deep breath, Toby pushed the door open and stepped out into the night. The cold hit him like a physical blow. It punched the air out of his lungs. The thin cotton of his flannel shirt offered exactly zero resistance to the wind. Within 30 seconds, his arms were covered in goosebumps. Within 2 minutes, his teeth were chattering violently. He started to jog, just like he had told Jim he would. But the dirt road was slick with black ice. After slipping and falling hard on his hip, he was forced to slow down to a brisk, agonizingly stiff walk. 1 mile to go, he thought, wrapping his arms tightly around his chest, his hands tucked under his armpits. His fingers were already going numb. He cursed himself. He cursed his bleeding heart instincts. Why did he care about some outlaw biker he had just thrown away 3 months of savings and subjected himself to absolute torture for a total stranger who would probably pawn the jacket for gas money the next day? The cold began to burn. His ears felt like they were being sliced by razor blades. He kept his eyes focused on the ground, placing one foot in front of the other, hallucinating the warmth of his trailer. He imagined his mum's space heater. He imagined a hot shower. By the time he finally saw the faint, yellow porch light of his family's trailer, Toby was stumbling. He couldn't feel his feet, and his vision was blurring at the edges. He practically threw himself up the metal steps, fumbling blindly with his keys with wooden, unresponsive fingers. He pushed the door open and collapsed onto the worn carpet of the living room, kicking the door shut behind him. He crawled toward the small heating vent in the floor, curling into a tight ball, shivering so violently that his muscles ached. He lay there for hours, the Zippo lighter pressing hard against his thigh, drifting into a restless, exhausted sleep, convinced he had made the stupidest mistake of his life. He had no idea that a few hours away, in the harsh fluorescent light of a hospital waiting room, Big Jim Larson was making a phone call that was about to turn Toby Harrison's world upside down. The harsh, grey morning light filtering through the frosted windows of the trailer was merciless. Toby groaned, his head pounding with a ferocious, dull ache. He was still curled up on the threadbare carpet directly over the heating vent, clutching his knees to his chest. His throat felt like it was lined with broken glass, and a deep, rattling cough tore through his chest the moment he tried to sit up. "Toby, what on earth are you doing on the floor?" His mother, Diane Harrison, stood in the doorway of the tiny kitchen, clutching a chipped ceramic mug of tea. She looked exhausted, the deep circles under her eyes, a permanent fixture since his father passed. When she saw him shivering, still wearing nothing but the thin, damp flannel shirt from the night before, her maternal instincts immediately kicked into overdrive. "Where is your coat?" she demanded, rushing over and pressing a cool hand against his burning forehead. "You're burning up, Toby. Honey, where is your Carhartt?" Toby averted his eyes, staring at the peeling linoleum. I lost it. Mum, I left it at the station. Someone must have swiped it while I was in the back." Diane's face fell. It was a look of pure, unadulterated defeat that broke Toby's heart. That jacket was a symbol of his hard work, an expensive necessity they absolutely could not afford to replace. "Oh, Toby," she whispered, her voice cracking. Okay. We'll figure it out. Get into bed. I'm going to make you some soup." For the next 4 hours, Toby drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the freezing mountain pass and the towering silhouette of Jim Larson disappearing into the snow. He felt a gnawing guilt for lying to his mother, but he couldn't bring himself to explain that he had given away their only valuable piece of winter clothing to a gang member. It was exactly 11:15 a.m. when the noise started. At first, it was just a low, barely perceptible hum. Toby thought it was the old refrigerator kicking into overdrive, but the hum didn't stop. It steadily grew deeper, heavier, vibrating through the thin aluminum walls of the trailer. Diane walked into his cramped bedroom, looking out the small window with a puzzled expression. "Is that a freight train? The tracks are 5 miles away. We shouldn't be able to hear it this loud." The hum escalated into a physical rumble. The water in the glass on Toby's nightstand began to ripple. The framed photograph of his father hanging in the hallway rattled violently against the cheap wood paneling. It sounded like a massive swarm of mechanical hornets was descending upon their quiet, snow-covered dirt road. Toby threw off his blankets, ignoring the dizzying rush of blood to his head, and stumbled to the front window in the living room. He pulled back the faded curtain and felt his blood turn to ice. It wasn't a train. It was an army. Rolling slowly down the narrow, snow-packed lane was a seemingly endless column of motorcycles. They rode in perfect, disciplined, staggered formation, their massive V-twin engines roaring in terrifying, unified harmony. The sheer volume was deafening, echoing off the surrounding pine trees. "Oh my God," Diane breathed, taking a terrified step back. "Toby, get away from the window. Lock the door." But Toby couldn't move. He was paralyzed, watching as over 100 heavily patched bikers rolled into their small cul-de-sac. The chrome of their customized Harley-Davidsons glinted dangerously in the pale winter sun. They wore heavy leather cuts over thick hoodies and flannels, the iconic Death Head logo emblazoned on every single back. The neighbors' curtains were twitching nervously, but nobody dared step outside. The Hells Angels had completely locked down the street. The column came to a halt, the engines idling with a deep, menacing thunder. Then, in a synchronized move that spoke of years of riding together, 100 kickstands slammed down onto the asphalt. The riders dismounted. Toby's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He scanned the crowd of massive, bearded men, frantically looking for the familiar face of Jim Larson. But Jim wasn't there. Instead, A man who looked even more intimidating stepped forward from the front of the pack. He was built like a cinder block, wearing a cut that bore the president patch on the front breast. He had a scar running through his left eyebrow and eyes as cold and hard as flint. The man walked straight past the rusty mailbox, up the small concrete walkway, and stood directly in front of the Harrisons' thin metal door. He didn't knock. He simply stood there, waiting. "Toby, I am calling the police right now," Diane said, her hands shaking so violently she dropped her cell phone on the carpet. "No." Toby grabbed her arm. "Mum, don't. Please, just let me handle this." Before she could stop him, Toby reached out with a trembling hand, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. A blast of cold air hit him, carrying the strong, distinct smell of exhaust fumes, stale cigarette smoke, and leather. The man on the porch stared down at Toby. Up close, he was even more terrifying. "You Toby?" the man asked. His voice was a deep, quiet gravel pit. "Yes, sir," Toby managed to squeak out, pulling his flannel tight against his shivering frame. The man nodded slowly. "Name's Wrench, Portland chapter president." He glanced past Toby to where Diane was cowering in the living room. "Mom, apologies for the noise. We ain't here to cause trouble." Wrench looked back at Toby and reached into the deep inside pocket of his leather vest. Toby flinched instinctively, but the biker didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a familiar, heavy canvas Carhartt jacket. It looked perfectly clean, smelling faintly of a professional dry cleaner. "Jim asked me to return this to you," Wrench said, holding it out. Toby took it slowly, the familiar weight of it offering a bizarre sense of comfort. Is Jim okay? Did he make it?" Wrench's hard eyes softened just a fraction, a shadow of grief passing over his scarred face. "He made it. Got to St. Jude's at 1:45 a.m. He got exactly 4 hours with Thomas before he passed. He was holding his hand when he took his last breath." Wrench paused, clearing his throat. "Thomas was a founding member of our chapter. He was Jim's sponsor 30 years ago. If Jim hadn't been there to send him off, it would have destroyed him." Wrench took a step closer, towering over the teenager. "Jim was suffering from stage 2 hypothermia when that trucker dropped him off. The doctors at the ER said if he hadn't been wearing this canvas jacket, his heart would have stopped from the cold before he ever reached the city limits." Toby swallowed hard, gripping the jacket tightly. "I'm just glad he made it." "You don't get it, kid," Wrench said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a weight that demanded absolute attention. "You didn't just give a guy a coat, you saved a brother's life, and you gave our chapter the gift of letting Thomas die with his family by his side. In our world, a debt like that isn't something you just say thanks for." Wrench snapped his fingers. A second biker, a tall, lanky man with a long braided beard, stepped up to the porch carrying a thick, heavy manila envelope and a large black garment bag. "Henderson, the trucker. He talks a lot," Wrench explained, taking the envelope. "Told Jim about how you were working graveyard shifts 'cause your old man passed and your mum's struggling with the bills. Told him how you walk 2 miles in the pitch black every night." Wrench shoved the thick envelope into Toby's chest. It was heavy, breathtakingly heavy. "There's $12,000 in there," Wrench stated matter-of-factly. "Every fully patched member in 3 state chapters emptied their wallets this morning. You pay off this trailer. You pay your mum's bills. You quit that graveyard shift and you focus on getting your high school diploma." Diane let out a choked, muffled sob from the hallway. pressing her hands over her mouth in absolute shock. I can't take this," Toby stammered, trying to hand the envelope back. "It was just a jacket. It's not a gift, kid. It's a settled debt. You insult us by handing it back," Wrench warned, though there was a hint of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. He then unzipped the black garment bag the other biker was holding. Inside was a breathtaking, custom-made, heavy black leather motorcycle jacket. It was lined with thick thermal shearling. "The Carhartt is good for the dirt, but this will keep the wind off you," Wrench said, draping the heavy leather over Toby's shoulder. "Check the inside pocket." Toby reached inside the smooth silk lining of the leather jacket. His fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. He pulled it out. It was the heavy silver Zippo lighter Jim had left on the counter. "You show that Zippo to anyone wearing our patch, anywhere in the world," Wrench said, his eyes locking onto Toby's with fierce, unyielding intensity. "You tell them Big Jim and Wrench said you are under the shield. Nobody touches you. Nobody messes with your mother. You have a problem. You make a call, and we will ride. Do you understand me, Toby?" Toby looked at the 100 imposing men standing in his driveway, the terrifying machines idling behind them, and the thick envelope of cash in his trembling hands, the crushing weight of his family's poverty, the fear of the winter, the exhaustion. It all evaporated in an instant. "I understand," Toby whispered, tears finally breaking free and tracking down his hot, feverish cheeks. Wrench nodded once, a gesture of absolute finality. He turned on his heel and walked back to his massive custom chopper. He swung his leg over, kicked the starter, and revved the engine. As one, the 100 Hell's Angels roared back to life. The sound shook the earth, vibrating deep in Toby's chest. He and his mother stood on the porch, wrapped in the freezing winter air, watching as the army of outlaws turned their bikes and thundered back down the snowy road, leaving behind a completely changed life and a debt paid in full. Sometimes, the greatest rewards come from the most unexpected sacrifices. Toby gave away his only defense against the bitter cold, never expecting an army of outlaws to repay his kindness with life-changing generosity. It proves that compassion speaks a universal language, even to the toughest crowds. If this incredible story of brotherhood and unexpected kindness moved you, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more unbelievable real-life stories. Saving a bleeding Hell's Angel from a mangled desert wreck seemed like a simple act of kindness to an 8-year-old girl. Her terrified mother, however, knew they had just painted a target on their backs. Come morning, 150 roaring Harley-Davidsons surrounded their diner, and they weren't there to say thank you. The Mojave Desert is an unforgiving place. It doesn't care about your plans, your past, or your secrets. For Sarah Reynolds, a 32-year-old single mother, running a rundown diner on a forgotten stretch of Route 93, the desert was both a sanctuary and a prison. The diner, the rust and rose, barely saw enough trucker traffic to keep the neon sign buzzing. But it was safe. It was quiet, until a blistering Tuesday evening in late August. Her 8-year-old daughter, Onyx, was out back playing in the dirt. Onyx was a child of the desert, fearless, curious, and entirely too trusting for the harsh world she inhabited. She was busy constructing a fortress out of discarded soda cans and smooth river stones when the deafening screech of tires shattered the twilight silence. It wasn't just a skid. It was the sickening, metallic crunch of heavy machinery meeting solid rock, followed by a violent tumbling sound that made the ground beneath Onyx's worn sneakers vibrate. Then, a heavy thud and silence. Onyx dropped her stones. Most children would have run inside to their mothers, but Onyx, driven by a naive instinct to help, pushed through the brittle sagebrush toward the highway bend. Down in the steep, rocky culvert off the shoulder, a massive Harley-Davidson lay on its side. The front wheel twisted at a grotesque angle, hot oil sizzling against the cracked exhaust. About 10 feet away lay the rider. He was a mountain of a man, clad in heavy, scuffed denim and a leather cut that had seen decades of miles. He lay face down, unmoving. Onyx slid down the embankment, the loose gravel tearing at her jeans. "Mister," she called out, her voice a tiny bell against the vast desert wind. "Are you okay?" A low groan escaped the man. He rolled over, clutching his side, and Onyx gasped. His face was a map of old scars and fresh, terrifying trauma. Blood poured from a jagged laceration on his forehead. But what was worse was the dark crimson stain rapidly spreading across the right side of his leather vest. As he turned, Onyx saw the unmistakable emblem on his back, the winged death head. The curved rockers read Hell's Angels on top and Arizona Nomads on the bottom. In the center, a small rectangular patch read Dutch. Kid. Dutch coughed, spitting a mixture of dust and blood. Get back. You're bleeding, Onyx stated, stating the obvious with the calm only a child possesses. She stepped closer. My mum has a first aid kit. We have Mickey Mouse Band-Aids. Dutch let out a weak, rattling chuckle that quickly turned into a wince of agony. Ain't gonna cut it, little bird. Somebody ran me off. Black SUV. He grabbed her tiny shoulder with a massive, tattooed hand. His grip was weak, trembling. Listen to me. Onyx. Where are you? Sarah's voice pierced the evening air, shrill with absolute panic. The screen door of the diner slammed open. Onyx didn't move away from the biker. Instead, she unzipped her favorite pink windbreaker, a garment far too warm for the desert, but one she refused to part with, and pressed it hard against the bleeding wound on Dutch's side. "Mum down here, he's hurt!" Onyx screamed back. Sarah appeared at the edge of the culvert, her eyes widening in sheer horror. She knew exactly what she was looking at. Growing up in California, she had heard the stories. You don't mess with the club. You don't get involved in their business. And you certainly don't find one bleeding out in your backyard. Onyx, step away from him right now. Sarah scrambled down the ditch, grabbing her daughter's arm to pull her back. No, Mum, he's dying. He needs pressure. You taught me that when I cut my knee. Onyx fought back, her small hands firmly pressing the now blood-soaked pink jacket against the biker's ribs. Dutch looked up at Sarah, the imposing outlaw, a man who had ridden with legendary figures like Sonny Barger and survived decades of turf wars, was entirely at the mercy of a terrified waitress and a stubborn 8-year-old. "Please," Dutch wheezed, his eyes losing focus. "Don't call the cops. Highway patrol. They're bought. The guy's in the SUV. I have to call an ambulance. You're bleeding to death," Sarah cried, her hands shaking as she pulled a bulky cell phone from her apron. Before she could dial, Dutch reached into his heavy leather boot with agonizing slowness. He pulled out something small, wrapped in a piece of oil-stained canvas, and a heavy silver ring adorned with a skull. With the last ounce of his strength, he grabbed Onyx's hand and shoved the items into her palm, closing her small fingers over them. "Hide it," Dutch whispered directly to Onyx, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, burning intensity. "Don't tell anyone. Not the cops. If my brothers come, Give it to Preacher. Only Preacher." His eyes rolled back, and the massive biker went entirely limp, his dead weight slumping against the bloody pink windbreaker. Sarah screamed, dialing 911 frantically. As she yelled the location to the dispatcher, she didn't notice Onyx slipping the heavy ring and the canvas-wrapped package deep into the pocket of her jeans. By the time the paramedics and the state troopers arrived, the sun had fully set. The flashing red and blue lights painted the desert in a sickly glow. They loaded Dutch onto a stretcher. He was barely breathing. A state trooper questioned Sarah aggressively, eyeing the diner as if he suspected her of harboring fugitives. He asked if the biker had said anything or handed anything off. Sarah honestly answered no. Onyx, sitting quietly on the bumper of a squad car, clutching a paramedic's blanket, said absolutely nothing. Sarah didn't sleep a wink that night. Every creak of the diner's old floorboards, every gust of wind against the tin roof sounded like an approaching threat. Around 2 a.m., while doing laundry to scrub the blood out of Onyx's clothes, Sarah found it. A heavy silver ring with the letters HAMC etched into the band, and a small, leather-bound notebook that had been tightly wrapped in the canvas. Sarah's blood ran cold. She opened the notebook. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger. Dates, initials, offshore account routing numbers, and a list of names, some of which belonged to high-ranking local politicians and law enforcement officials. Dutch hadn't just been in an accident. He had been carrying a death warrant. "What did you do?" "Onyx," Sarah whispered into the dark, her hands trembling so violently she dropped the book. If the people in the black SUV came looking for this, they were dead. If the Hell's Angels came looking for this and thought she had stolen it from a dying brother, they were worse than dead. Morning broke with a heavy, oppressive heat. Sarah unlocked the front door of the Rust and Rose at 6 a.m., her eyes ringed with dark circles. She had packed 2 duffel bags. Her plan was to serve whatever truckers came through for the morning rush, take the cash from the register, and drive north to Oregon by noon. They had to disappear. By 8 a.m., the diner was entirely empty. Not a single car had passed on Route 93 for nearly an hour. The silence was unnatural. It felt like the desert was holding its breath. Then, it began. It started as a low vibration, a frequency felt in the chest before it was registered by the ears. The coffee in the glass pots on the burners began to ripple. The silverware on the tables rattled softly against the formica. Sarah stepped out onto the front porch, shielding her eyes from the blinding morning sun. Down the long, straight ribbon of asphalt, a black mass was moving over the horizon. The low hum grew into a guttural, terrifying roar. It sounded like an approaching thunderstorm, localized entirely on the highway. Within minutes, they were there. It wasn't 5 bikers. It wasn't 10. It was an endless column of roaring chrome, heavy leather, and roaring V-twin engines. 150 Hell's Angels. They swarmed the diner like a mechanized army. They filled the dirt parking lot, blocked the highway in both directions, and surrounded the perimeter of the building. The air grew thick with the smell of exhaust, hot rubber, and unyielding intimidation. Sarah froze in the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. The engines cut out in rolling waves, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in their wake. Dust swirled around heavy boots as men dismounted. They were massive, heavily tattooed, their faces grim and unreadable. Patches from California, Arizona, Nevada, and even as far as Washington were visible on their backs. They formed a semicircle around the front of the diner, standing shoulder to shoulder. A path cleared down the center of the formation. A single rider walked forward. He was taller than the rest, broad-shouldered, with a graying beard and a long scar that ran from his left temple down to his jawline. The patch on his left breast simply read, President. This had to be Preacher. Sarah's survival instinct kicked in. She backed into the diner, locked the glass door, and ran to the kitchen. Onyx, get in the pantry. Hide behind the flour sacks and do not come out, she hissed, shoving the bewildered 8-year-old into the small closet. The front bell chimed as the glass door was shattered. The deadbolt kicked entirely out of the wooden frame with a single, brutal boot strike. Heavy footsteps echoed on the linoleum. Sarah stood behind the main counter, her hand secretly gripping a heavy cast-iron skillet beneath the register. It was a pathetic weapon against an army. But a mother's desperation knows no logic. Preacher walked to the counter. Up close, his presence was suffocating. He didn't look angry. He looked absolutely ruthless. Behind him, 4 other imposing bikers stepped into the diner, blocking the exit. You, the owner. Preacher's voice was like grinding gravel. Yes, Sarah choked out, trying to keep her chin up. We're closed. Preacher ignored her. He looked around the diner, his eyes sweeping over the cheap vinyl booths and the dusty jukebox. My sergeant-at-arms, Dutch. He was found out back last night, almost bled to death in the dirt. I called the ambulance, Sarah said quickly, her voice raising in pitch. We found him. We helped him. I didn't see who ran him off. Preacher slowly rested his massive, calloused hands on the counter. He leaned in. I know you didn't see who ran him off, lady. Because if you did, you'd be in the morgue right now. But I also know that Dutch was carrying something very important to this club, something that wasn't on him when the paramedics cut his vest off. I don't know what you're talking about, Sarah lied, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of her neck. Preacher stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then, with a sudden, fluid motion, he reached into his leather cut, pulled out a massive 10-inch hunting knife, and slammed it blade first into the Formica counter right between Sarah's hands. Sarah shrieked, jumping back. Don't lie to me, Preacher growled, the calmness in his voice entirely gone, replaced by a dark, simmering menace. We know what the little girl took from Dutch. We have eyes everywhere. Bring her out, or my brothers and I tear this place down to the foundation to find it. From the back of the diner, the small, squeaky hinges of the pantry door slowly creaked open. Mom? Onyx's small voice echoed in the tense, silent room. Preacher pulled the knife from the counter, turning his massive frame toward the hallway. The 150 men outside stood in absolute silence, waiting for their president's command. The small, squeaky hinges of the pantry door echoed like a gunshot in the silent diner. Onyx stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. She wasn't trembling, though her face was pale under the fluorescent lights. In her right hand, she clutched the heavy, oil-stained canvas package, and looped over her thumb was the massive silver skull ring. Onyx! No! Sarah screamed, lunging forward from behind the counter. Before Sarah could take 2 steps, the 4 massive bikers flanking the door moved with terrifying synchronization. They didn't draw weapons, but they formed a solid wall of leather and muscle, physically blocking the mother from her child. Don't touch her, Sarah shrieked, tears finally spilling hot over her cheeks. Take whatever you want, just don't hurt my daughter. Preacher held up a single, heavily scarred hand. The room fell dead silent. He didn't look at Sarah. His dark, piercing eyes were entirely fixed on the 8-year-old girl walking slowly toward him. Onyx stopped 3 feet away from the president of the Hells Angels. She craned her neck upward, looking at the man who towered over her like a California redwood. "Are you Preacher?" Onyx asked, her voice steady, though small. Preacher slowly lowered himself to one knee, the heavy leather of his riding pants creaking. Now, he was at eye level with her. Up close, Onyx could see the intricate tattoos weaving around his neck and the deep lines of a life lived hard and violently. "I am," Preacher rumbled, his voice softening just a fraction. "And who might you be? Little bird." "I'm Onyx. Dutch told me to call you." She held out her small hand, opening her fingers to reveal the silver HAMC ring. "He told me to give you this. He said he was hurt bad by men in a black SUV. Preacher gently took the heavy ring from her palm. He turned it over in his calloused fingers, a flash of genuine grief crossing his hardened features. He slipped it into his vest pocket. "Dutch is a good man. He's in the hospital right now, fighting for his life. You kept him alive, Onyx. The paramedic said your jacket stopped the bleeding just enough." Onyx nodded, then held out the canvas-wrapped package. "He told me to hide this. He said I couldn't tell the police. He said only to give it to Preacher." The tension in the diner spiked. The 4 bikers at the door shifted, their hands dropping subtly toward their waistbands. Preacher took the package, unfolding the greasy canvas to reveal the small, black, leather-bound ledger. He thumbed open the pages, his eyes scanning the handwritten columns of dates, offshore routing numbers, and names. A cold, terrifying smile spread across Preacher's face. "Mother of God?" one of the bikers by the door muttered. "He actually got it." Preacher stood up, closing the ledger with a sharp snap. He looked over at Sarah, who was leaning against the counter, sobbing quietly. "Your daughter is a braver soldier than half the men I've ridden with. Lady, you have no idea what she just handed me." "I don't want to know," Sarah whispered frantically. "Please, just take it and leave. Leave us alone." "I wish it were that simple," Preacher said, his voice dropping to a dangerous baritone. He walked over to the shattered front door, looking out at the 150 men swarming the parking lot. "This book, it's a list of every dirty DEA agent, every corrupt county judge, and every compromised sheriff in a 300-mile radius. Men who have been using our club's routes to move cartel fentanyl, trying to pin the bodies on us. Dutch spent 2 years undercover gathering this. Before Sarah could process the magnitude of what he was saying, the ground beneath the diner began to vibrate again. This time, it wasn't the rhythmic, thunderous rumble of Harley-Davidsons. It was the heavy, aggressive roar of high-powered V8 engines. Preacher's head snapped toward the highway. "Speak of the devil!" 3 massive, unmarked black Chevrolet Suburbans tore off Route 93, skidding violently into the dirt parking lot. The Hells Angels immediately reacted. The relaxed, waiting posture of the 150 bikers vanished in an instant. Men reached into their leather cuts, pulling out heavy steel chains, brass knuckles, and the cold, dark steel of semi-automatic pistols. They formed a tight, impenetrable perimeter around the front of the diner. The doors of the Suburbans flew open. Out poured a dozen men in heavy tactical gear. They wore bulletproof vests, but there were no police badges, no agency insignias, just heavily armed men gripping assault rifles, their faces covered by dark balaclavas. Leading them was a man Sarah recognized with a jolt of pure terror. It was Captain Harrison from the County Sheriff's Department. He was out of uniform, wearing a dark tactical vest and holding a Remington shotgun. He was the man who had come to the diner last year asking for protection money. "Preacher!" Harrison bellowed over the idling engines of the SUVs, racking a shell into the chamber of his shotgun. "This doesn't involve the club hand over the ledger, and you boys can ride back to Oakland with the wind in your hair. You keep it, and we leave 150 bodies in the Mojave." The arrival of the black SUVs crushed the air into silence. Heat shimmered above the asphalt as engines idled, and a wall of bikers stood unmoving, shoulder to shoulder. Across from them, armed men in tactical gear stepped out, rifles ready. They had the weapons, but the bikers had something colder, the willingness to die where they stood. Inside, Preacher didn't move. His voice, calm and sharp, cut through the tension. "Get the woman and the kid to the back. You shield them. No mistakes." Sarah was rushed behind heavy equipment, clutching Onyx tightly as fear rattled through her body. She prayed in silence, realizing the men she once feared were now her only protection. Onyx, however, stayed quiet, watching through a narrow gap, eyes fixed on the figures guarding them. Then Preacher stepped outside, boots crunching on broken glass. He walked into the open, exposed and unarmed, the black ledger resting in his hand, calm in the face of violence. "Harrison!" Preacher's voice boomed over the parking lot, rich, dark, and utterly devoid of fear. "You boys really screwed the pooch on this one. You ran my brother off the road. You spilled club blood on my highway. There is a heavy price for that." Captain Harrison leveled his Remington shotgun squarely at Preacher's chest. The corrupt deputy was sweating profusely beneath his heavy Kevlar vest, his eyes darting nervously across the sea of silent, staring bikers. "This doesn't involve the club, Preacher," Harrison shouted, though his voice lacked the authoritative bark he desired. Dutch got greedy. He stuck his nose where it didn't belong, trying to play hero. "Now throw the damn book over here, and you boys can ride back to Oakland with the wind in your hair. You keep it, and we leave 150 bodies rotting in the Mojave." Harrison took a step forward, gesturing with the barrel of his shotgun toward the diner. "We know the woman and the kid have seen our faces. Don't make us go through you to get to them. Nobody else has to die today if you just hand over the ledger." Preacher didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a low, rumbling chuckle that sent a visible shiver down the spine of the deputy standing closest to Harrison. It was the laugh of a predator who had just watched his prey walk willingly into a trap. "You think you're the only one who knows how to play the game?" Captain Preacher asked, stepping off the porch and walking directly toward the barrel of the shotgun. "You think I brought an army out here, blind, to play target practice with a bunch of bought and paid for badge wearers?" Harrison's grip tightened on the shotgun pump. "What the hell are you talking about?" Preacher stopped 10 feet away. He held the little black leather book up to the blinding sunlight. "This book, it's just paper and ink. A souvenir. It's worthless now." Harrison frowned, his confusion warring with his anger. "Stop playing games. Preacher, throw the book. The photographs I took of every single page inside this ledger with my encrypted phone 10 minutes ago." Preacher continued, ignoring the command entirely. "Those are already gone. They're currently sitting in the secure inbox of the FBI's Internal Affairs Division in D.C. And just for a little extra insurance, I CC'd the chief editor of the Los Angeles Times. I hit send right before you pulled up." The blood drained completely from Harrison's face, leaving him a sickly, pale gray. "By lunch, your offshore accounts will be frozen," Preacher said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "By dinner, your cartel bosses down in Sonora are going to see your faces plastered all over the national news for losing their money and exposing their supply lines. You're dead men walking. Harrison, the only question is whether you die out here in the dirt today or in a maximum security prison yard next week. The men behind Harrison deputies who had traded everything for easy money began to lower their assault rifles. One of them, a younger man with terrified eyes, took a frantic step back toward the open door of the Suburban. "You're bluffing!" Harrison spat, saliva flying from his lips. "You didn't send anything." "Am I?" Preacher smiled. It was a dark, terrifying expression. "Shoot me. Go ahead. Pull the trigger. But understand this if you do. My brothers will tear you and your men apart with their bare hands. You might take down 20 of us with those rifles, but the remaining 130 will rip your heads off before you can even reload. And then you burn anyway." The standoff hung by a razor-thin thread. The desert wind howled, kicking up dust around their boots. Harrison looked at the unwavering, hardened faces of the bikers. He looked at their heavy chains and cold eyes. He realized, with a sinking, nauseating dread, that Preacher was telling the absolute truth. The Hell's Angels were ready to embrace death. His men were not. "Back to the trucks," Harrison choked out, his voice trembling with defeated rage. "Fall back now." The tactical team didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled frantically back into the black Suburbans, nearly trampling each other in their haste. Tires spun wildly, kicking up a massive cloud of choking yellow dust as the SUVs violently reversed out of the dirt lot and sped away down Route 93, fleeing like cowards into the heat distortion on the horizon. A collective breath was released, but the Hell's Angels didn't cheer. They simply lowered their weapons, returning them silently to their waistbands and saddlebags. They had held the line. Preacher turned his back on the highway and walked back into the diner. He stepped into the wrecked kitchen, looking down at Sarah and Onyx, who were just beginning to stand up from behind the deep fryer. The 4 massive guards stepped aside, giving their president room. "It's over," Preacher said softly, his voice remarkably gentle compared to the monster he had been moments ago. "They're gone. They won't be coming back. The feds will be hunting them by sundown, and the cartels will be hunting them by midnight." Sarah scrambled to her feet, pulling Onyx tightly against her chest, her whole body shaking violently. "Thank you," she sobbed, completely overwhelmed. "Thank you for not letting them hurt us. I thought we were going to die." Preacher shook his head slowly. "You don't owe me a damn thing. Lady, we owe you." He reached inside his heavy leather cut and pulled out a thick manila envelope. It was heavily worn and bulging at the seams. He tossed it onto the stainless steel prep counter. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud that echoed in the quiet kitchen. "There's 50 grand in cash in there," Preacher said, ignoring Sarah's gasp of absolute shock. "Dutch was carrying club funds when they ran him off the road. We consider it hazard pay for the mess we brought to your doorstep. Fix your front door. Pack up your life. Take the kid somewhere nice and safe. Send her to a decent school away from this wasteland." Sarah stared at the envelope, her mind entirely unable to comprehend the sudden reversal of her life's fortunes. I can't take this. It's too much." "It's not a request," Preacher stated firmly. Then he knelt down one last time, ignoring the creaking of his knees, and looked directly at Onyx. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, beautifully embroidered patch. It was a miniature version of the winged death head, but with a small, golden halo hovering above the skull. You're a brave kid. Onyx, Preacher said, gently pressing the patch into her small, dirty palm. Braver than most grown men I know. You ever need anything, and I mean absolutely anything in this world, you find a guy flying our colors. You show them this patch, and you tell them Preacher said you're family. The club protects its own. Onyx smiled, her eyes shining as she tightly gripped the embroidered fabric. Tell Dutch I hope he feels better. I will. Little bird. Preacher smiled back. He stood up, tipped his head respectfully to Sarah, and walked out of the diner. A minute later, the terrifying, thunderous roar of 150 engines ignited simultaneously. Sarah and Onyx walked to the shattered doorway, holding hands, watching as the massive black swarm of motorcycles rolled out onto Route 93. They headed back toward the horizon, leaving nothing but dust, a fortune on the counter, and a changed life behind them. Sometimes, the greatest heroes don't wear capes, they wear heavy leather and ride loud motorcycles. This incredible real-life story proves that a single act of innocent kindness can turn the most hardened outlaws into guardian angels. If Onyx's bravery and the Hells Angels' terrifying loyalty left you speechless, hit that like button, share this incredible story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable true stories